In the summer of 1984, Harper's Ridge, nestled in the gentle hills of North Carolina, was a town that seemed untouched by the turbulence of the outside world. The town's serene streets, lined with modest homes and shade-giving trees, painted the picture of a peaceful life. The soft hum of crickets at dusk, the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the sound of children's laughter echoed in the air, making Harper's Ridge feel like a place frozen in time. Yet beneath the idyllic calm, something darker was stirring, unnoticed by most. Evelyn Harper, a 39-year-old accountant, was a woman of precision. She lived in a well-organized home, upheld by a rigorous schedule. Every day she moved through life with a quiet discipline, from her job at the local firm to her meticulous homekeeping. She often kept to herself, a trait that led her neighbors to speculate about the secrets she carried inside her, something they couldn't quite grasp but sensed might be there. Her husband Matthew, a 42-year-old car salesman, was a man who could charm anyone he met. But his emotions were another matter. He was a man of few words and even fewer revelations. His easygoing demeanor barely concealed the tension that had begun to build between him and Evelyn. Their marriage had, from the outside, appeared to be the epitome of stability, but recently cracks had begun to show. Evelyn's resignation from her job as an accountant had come as a surprise to everyone, including her closest friends. They had known her as someone who thrived in her career, but now she was retreating from her professional life. The reasons for her resignation were never clearly explained, and the emotional toll it took on her was evident. It was a change that everyone noticed, though no one truly understood. That evening, as Evelyn prepared for her weekly bridge game, a regular event she had always enjoyed, there was an unusual tension in the air. She moved with a sense of urgency, but it was the kind of unease that can only be felt in the smallest of movements. The tightness in her shoulders, the quick glances she cast at the clock, the way her eyes flickered nervously as she prepared to leave. When she kissed Matthew goodbye, she lingered a moment longer than usual. Her smile was forced, her words clipped. She told him it was nothing, but something in her gaze said otherwise. He returned the kiss absently, distracted by the quiet tension that seemed to have taken hold of their home. She stepped out the door, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floors, and drove away in her Volkswagen Beetle. The sound of the engine faded into the night, but as it did, a sense of foreboding seemed to settle over the house. Evelyn's departure that evening was routine, a simple outing to play cards with friends. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that something wasn't right. The storm, a summer downpour that had begun in the late afternoon, intensified as the night unfolded. Thick clouds hung heavily in the sky, obscuring the moonlight and turning the air oppressive. Rain fell in sheets, turning the streets of Harper's Ridge into slick, glistening ribbons of water. The atmosphere was dense, weighed down by the relentless downpour. As the clock struck 9, Evelyn's friends began to wonder where she was. She had never missed a game before. By 10, the first calls were made. At first, it was dismissed as a simple delay, perhaps due to the weather. But by midnight, the concern was unmistakable. Evelyn had never arrived at the game. Her friends' concern turned into confusion, and by the time Matthew was called, panic had begun to set in. Her absence was a mystery. He hadn't heard from her either, and his mind began to race. Evelyn was never one to leave without notice, especially not without calling. He dialed her number again and again, but each time, the line went dead. Then the first clue arrived. In the early hours of the morning, as the storm continued to lash against the town, a local farmer who had been driving home from a late shift reported seeing a car parked on a quiet stretch of road. The car, Evelyn's Volkswagen Beetle, was abandoned, its door wide open, the interior untouched. The car sat there, a lone sentinel in the storm, waiting for answers. As Matthew stood by the phone, helpless, the hours dragged on, and he could feel the weight of an impending nightmare beginning to press down on him. No sign of Evelyn, no evidence of a struggle, only the car, abandoned and alone. Its faint echoes of a life once lived now, all that remained. The search began in the early morning hours. The town, once peaceful and quiet, was now filled with the tremors of uncertainty. Neighbors and friends gathered, scanning the area, hoping for any sign of Evelyn's whereabouts. Yet the rain soaked the land, and every effort to search the dense woods, the streets, and the surrounding hills seemed to yield no answers. The storm, a force of nature that had once been nothing more than an inconvenience, had now become a symbol of the mystery that loomed over Harper's Ridge. By dawn, the authorities were called, and the first official search was launched. The quiet town had been thrust into a mystery that no one had expected. The absence of signs, a lack of footprints, personal belongings, or any trace of Evelyn, left the authorities grappling with a baffling situation. The quiet of Harper's Ridge was shattered, replaced by the echoing questions of what had really happened to Evelyn Harper. With each passing hour, Detective Claire Donovan, newly assigned to the case, could feel the pressure mounting. The investigation, which seemed so straightforward at first, was now unfolding into something much more complicated. There was more to Evelyn's disappearance than anyone realized. Something deep, something dark. The community, once united by its tranquility, was now divided by suspicion, fear, and a growing sense of dread. The search for Evelyn Harper had begun in earnest, but it was clear from the start that her disappearance was no simple case. The tight-knit town of Harper's Ridge, where everyone knew each other's name, was now gripped by a growing sense of unease. The small, quiet community was not accustomed to dealing with such a mystery, and as each day passed, the questions multiplied. Detective Claire Donovan, assigned to the case, quickly took charge of the investigation. The discovery of Evelyn's abandoned car on the side of a desolate road was the first major clue, but it raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no blood, nothing to suggest any kind of violent confrontation. The car's interior was neat, the keys still in the ignition, and the door left ajar as if Evelyn had simply stepped out and walked away. The only thing missing was Evelyn herself. The investigation turned to the area surrounding the car, a desolate stretch of road on the outskirts of town. The rain that had poured relentlessly the night before had washed away any potential tracks, leaving the ground slick and impenetrable. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing unusual that night. No sounds of a struggle, no screams, nothing out of the ordinary. The eerie silence left the authorities feeling as though they were searching for a ghost. As the search team expanded their efforts to comb the surrounding woods and rural paths, Donovan began to focus on the people closest to Evelyn. Matthew, her husband, was understandably distraught, but his behavior raised suspicion. Despite his outward show of concern, there was something unsettling about the way he responded to the news of his wife's disappearance. His answers were measured, almost too rehearsed, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. His calmness in the face of such a tragedy was troubling. Matthew's story was simple. Evelyn had gone out for a bridge game with friends, but that story, when examined closely, didn't hold up. Matthew had claimed that Evelyn had been fine when she left, but friends and family members painted a different picture. They described her as increasingly withdrawn in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She had stopped attending social gatherings, and even at work she had become distant. She had suddenly resigned from her job, an abrupt decision that left her colleagues stunned. No one understood why she had left, and her resignation, coupled with her erratic behavior, had caused concern among those closest to her. Donovan delved deeper into Evelyn's past, speaking to those who knew her best. Lillian Carter, Evelyn's lifelong friend, provided some chilling insights. Lillian had been worried about Evelyn for months. They had spoken often, and Evelyn had confided in her about her troubles at work. She had mentioned a man, Daniel Foster, a colleague at the accounting firm, who had become increasingly obsessive in his behavior. Evelyn had told Lillian that Foster's advances had made her uncomfortable, but she had brushed it off, convinced that it was nothing to worry about. Lillian's worry deepened when Evelyn began to pull away from her circle of friends. Lillian believed that Evelyn had been considering leaving Matthew, though she couldn't be sure. The thought of Evelyn leaving her husband seemed unthinkable. After all, they had been married for over a decade. But the signs were there. The unease in Evelyn's voice, the restlessness in her movements, the subtle hints that something was wrong. The investigation took a darker turn when Detective Donovan learned that Evelyn had recently withdrawn a large sum of money from her bank account. The amount was enough to raise eyebrows, and it suggested that Evelyn had been planning something. But what? Was she preparing to leave her husband? Had she been running away from something more dangerous? In the days that followed, the town was filled with speculation. Some believed that Evelyn had simply run away, unable to cope with the pressures of her life. Others wondered if something more sinister was at play. Could she have been abducted? Had she been the victim of foul play? The case grew increasingly complicated, and as each new detail emerged, the pieces of the puzzle became more fragmented. Matthew's inability to provide any new information only fueled suspicion. Was he hiding something? Had he been involved in his wife's disappearance? His story remained unchanged, yet with each passing day, his composure seemed less convincing. As Donovan continued to investigate, the case seemed to grow colder, but the questions persisted. Where was Evelyn? Had she disappeared voluntarily, or had something far darker happened to her? The mystery deepened with each passing hour, and the small town of Harper's Ridge, once peaceful and calm, was now a place shrouded in fear. As the search for Evelyn Harper continued, Detective Claire Donovan realized that the more she uncovered, the more complex the case became. What had initially appeared to be a simple missing person case had transformed into something far more sinister. The deeper Donovan dug into Evelyn's life, the more secrets began to surface. Secrets that Evelyn had kept buried beneath a facade of normalcy. The first unsettling discovery came when Donovan revisited Evelyn's workplace. Her colleagues were quick to share their memories of Evelyn, but it was clear that they too had been taken by surprise at her sudden disappearance. There had been whispers about Evelyn's resignation, about her sudden withdrawal from social circles, but no one had suspected that something was amiss until she had gone missing. Evelyn had been under a great deal of stress at work. As an accountant, she was known for her attention to detail, her dedication, and her perfectionism. She had often stayed late, poring over figures, ensuring every number was in its place. But in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, something had changed. She had started leaving work early, her once meticulous routines now disrupted by a sense of unease. Her colleagues spoke of a woman who had become increasingly distracted, often lost in thought, her eyes clouded with worry. But what had caused this shift? No one could provide a clear answer. Donovan's next breakthrough came when she revisited Evelyn's personal belongings, specifically her desk at the accounting firm. There, hidden in the back of a drawer, was a small leather-bound diary. The journal, though worn and slightly weathered, contained a wealth of insights into Evelyn's emotional state in the months leading up to her disappearance. The diary entries started off innocuously enough, with Evelyn reflecting on the usual details of her day, her work, the people she interacted with, the small pleasures and disappointments of her life. But as Donovan flipped through the pages, she began to notice a disturbing pattern. The tone of Evelyn's writing grew darker as time passed, the entries filled with anxiety, fear, and a growing sense of being trapped. One entry stood out, dated just a week before her disappearance. In it, Evelyn wrote, "I can't seem to shake this feeling that someone is watching me. Every step I take, I feel like I'm being followed. I don't know who to trust anymore. It's as if the walls are closing in, and I can't escape." This entry sent a chill down Donovan's spine. It was clear that Evelyn had been under tremendous emotional and psychological pressure. But what was the source of her fear? Who had been following her? And why hadn't she mentioned it to anyone? Donovan knew that the diary could provide the answers she needed, but it was still not enough to tie the clues together. There had to be more. And there was. Evelyn's friend Lillian Carter had witnessed firsthand the growing unease that Evelyn had experienced in her final days. Lillian had been one of the few people Evelyn had confided in, and it was Lillian who revealed the disturbing details of a man named Daniel Foster. Daniel Foster had once been a colleague of Evelyn's at the accounting firm. He had been dismissed months earlier under unclear circumstances, but his obsession with Evelyn had never truly ceased. According to Lillian, Daniel had become fixated on Evelyn long before he left the firm. He had lingered around her desk, made inappropriate remarks, and even showed up uninvited to social events where Evelyn was present. But Evelyn had never told anyone the full extent of the harassment. She had brushed it off, believing that it would eventually pass. However, as time went on, Daniel's behavior grew more erratic. Lillian remembered how Evelyn had become increasingly uncomfortable in Daniel's presence. Evelyn had spoken to her about the man's obsession, about how he had once followed her to her car after work. At the time, Evelyn had dismissed it as harmless, but now looking back, Lillian could see that the situation had been far more serious than Evelyn had let on. Donovan's investigation into Daniel Foster revealed some troubling information. After his dismissal from the firm, Daniel had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, and despite multiple attempts to track him down, he remained elusive. It was clear to Donovan that Daniel's obsession with Evelyn was not something that could be ignored. She suspected that he might know more about her disappearance than anyone realized. The more Donovan dug into Evelyn's personal life, the more it seemed that her marriage to Matthew was also far from perfect. On the surface, the couple had appeared to be happily married, but as Donovan uncovered more about their relationship, it became clear that there were cracks beneath the surface. Friends had described Matthew as being controlling, possessive even, and Evelyn's sudden withdrawal from social activities seemed to coincide with this pattern. Had Evelyn been trying to escape a troubled marriage? Had she been trying to free herself from Matthew's influence? The investigation was taking on a new dimension. As the pieces began to fall into place, it was becoming evident that Evelyn's disappearance wasn't the result of a random act. She had been running from something, or someone, and the truth was starting to reveal itself in the shadows. But the more Donovan uncovered, the more questions emerged. Was Evelyn trying to escape a toxic relationship, or had she been the victim of something more dangerous? And where was she now? As the search for Evelyn Harper continued, the town of Harper's Ridge found itself overwhelmed by a palpable sense of dread. What had once been a peaceful community was now gripped by fear and uncertainty, as the mystery of Evelyn's disappearance seemed to deepen with every passing hour. The search parties, composed of local volunteers and law enforcement, scoured the woods, fields, and roads, but no new evidence emerged. The once picturesque streets of the town now seemed eerily quiet, their usual charm replaced by an atmosphere thick with unease. Detective Claire Donovan knew that the case was slipping into the realm of the cold. Despite her relentless efforts, the lack of solid leads made it difficult to make progress. The initial optimism that accompanied the early stages of the search had faded, and now the team was left grasping at straws, hoping for a breakthrough that seemed increasingly unlikely. One morning, after another exhaustive search yielded no new clues, Donovan decided to expand their methods. They brought in sonar technology, an advanced tool that could scan bodies of water more effectively than the human eye. Harper's Ridge was surrounded by lakes, ponds, and creeks, all of which had yet to be thoroughly investigated. Perhaps, Donovan reasoned, the key to Evelyn's disappearance lay beneath the surface of one of these still waters. The sonar scans were slow and meticulous. The boat, equipped with sonar devices, glided across the calm waters, searching for anything that could provide a clue. Hours passed with little to show for the effort, and the air became heavy with frustration. But just as the team was preparing to call it a day, the sonar picked up an anomaly, a dark shape beneath the water, distinct against the murky background. The crew stopped the boat and prepared for a dive. The discovery, though not immediately identifiable, could be the breakthrough they had been hoping for. As the divers descended into the cold, dark water, Donovan's heart raced. She knew that this could be the moment when everything changed. Minutes later, the diver resurfaced, his face grim. He pointed toward the object at the bottom of the pond, and as Donovan's eyes followed, she saw it. A small, rusted car, partially buried under layers of silt and debris. However, it wasn't Evelyn's car. The car was old, likely abandoned years ago. Its condition suggested that it had been submerged for quite some time. Its age a reminder that not every mystery could be solved immediately. The search had begun to feel like chasing shadows, each lead fizzling out into nothing. But just as hope seemed to be slipping away, an unexpected development brought a new surge of urgency to the investigation. A local shopkeeper, a woman who ran a small convenience store on the outskirts of town, came forward with information that would change the course of the case. The shopkeeper had seen something on the night Evelyn disappeared. A man, walking alone along the road near where Evelyn's car had been abandoned. The description she gave matched that of Daniel Foster, the former colleague of Evelyn's whom Donovan had already identified as a potential suspect. The sighting occurred shortly before the car had been found, and the shopkeeper recalled that Daniel had looked agitated, disheveled, as if he had been in a hurry. This revelation sent a ripple of excitement through the investigation team. The shopkeeper's account placed Daniel Foster near the scene at the crucial time, and it tied him more directly to Evelyn's disappearance than any other lead. It was the breakthrough Donovan had been waiting for. Donovan immediately ordered a review of Daniel's known whereabouts on the night of Evelyn's disappearance. The more they dug into his past, the clearer it became that Daniel's obsession with Evelyn had not been a passing infatuation. His behavior had grown increasingly erratic, and there were multiple instances of him showing up unannounced at Evelyn's home and workplace. He had been a man desperate for Evelyn's attention, and now Donovan began to suspect that he had crossed the line from obsession to something far more dangerous. But Daniel Foster was nowhere to be found. His apartment had been emptied, his personal belongings gone. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, disappearing just as quickly as he had appeared in Evelyn's life. It wasn't just that he had left town, it was as if he had been preparing for something, perhaps even anticipating this moment. As Donovan and her team scoured the area, searching for any trace of Daniel, a deeper pattern began to emerge. His movements, his obsession with Evelyn, the strange coincidences, it all pointed to a man who had been hiding in plain sight, someone who had been lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. The more Donovan thought about it, the more it seemed that Daniel's disappearance was far from accidental. He had known something, perhaps about Evelyn's life, perhaps about Matthew's involvement. He had been in the perfect position to make a move, and now with Evelyn gone, the question remained. Was Daniel Foster the key to solving the mystery of her disappearance? Or had he simply been another pawn in a much larger game? The investigation into Evelyn Harper's disappearance had stretched into its 6th week, and the case had grown more complicated with each passing day. Detective Claire Donovan had been running down every lead, following each clue as if it were the key to unraveling the mystery. But the more she uncovered, the less certain she became. Evelyn's disappearance was no longer just a case of a missing person. It had become a labyrinth of uncertainty, filled with false leads, hidden secrets, and unanswered questions. The storm that had raged the night Evelyn disappeared, once considered little more than a backdrop, was now taking on greater significance in Donovan's mind. The rain, the slick roads, the thick clouds, all of it had contributed to the sense of disorientation that had accompanied Evelyn's final hours. It was clear that the weather had played a pivotal role in her disappearance, but Donovan was still unsure how it fit into the puzzle. Evelyn's car had been found on a quiet, rural road, the rain-soaked streets reflecting the dim light of the street lamps. The car was parked neatly on the side of the road, its door ajar, but there were no signs of a struggle. No evidence that Evelyn had been forced from her car. No physical evidence of any kind that could explain her sudden disappearance. And yet the sense that something sinister had occurred lingered in the air, hanging over the investigation like a dark cloud. Donovan had spent countless hours reviewing the evidence, considering every possibility. Could Evelyn have been disoriented by the storm, perhaps losing control of her car in the rain and crashing? Could she have wandered off, confused by the heavy downpour, lost in the woods or along the creek? It was a theory that Donovan found hard to dismiss, especially when she considered Evelyn's health. Evelyn had suffered from diabetes for years, a condition that could cause confusion and disorientation, especially if her blood sugar had dropped. As Donovan reviewed the scene again, she began to focus on the tire tracks left near the abandoned car. They were inconsistent with a normal stop. The marks suggested that Evelyn's car had swerved sharply before sliding off the road and coming to a halt. Donovan couldn't ignore the possibility that Evelyn's low blood sugar had contributed to her losing control of the vehicle. But if that were the case, why had she not left any signs of distress? Why had there been no footprints, no indication that she had been struggling? The absence of these clues made her theory feel less certain. The deeper Donovan dug, the more the storm seemed to symbolize the chaos that had taken over Evelyn's life in her final days. The external storm mirrored the turmoil inside Evelyn, and now in the quiet aftermath, the search for answers seemed like an uphill battle against the forces of nature. With no clear signs, the investigation was forced into the murky depths of uncertainty. Like the storm that had come and gone, leaving only questions in its wake. But even as Donovan questioned every lead, there was a sense of something more, something hidden beneath the surface. Could it be that Evelyn hadn't simply lost control of her car? Had she been running from something? The more Donovan thought about it, the more she realized that the storm, while a powerful force, was just one element in a much larger and darker story. Evelyn's disappearance was not a random event. It was something deliberate, something calculated. The storm had been a catalyst, but there was something deeper at play. As the weeks passed, the search for Evelyn Harper had slowed to a crawl. The initial fervor had given way to a quiet resignation, as time and again, the investigators came up empty. The town, once filled with whispers and theories, was now eerily silent. The storm had passed, but the questions remained, each one more elusive than the last. No sign of Evelyn had emerged, and the town's faith in the investigation was starting to fade. Yet Donovan wasn't ready to give up. She knew that the truth was out there somewhere, hiding beneath layers of confusion, waiting to be discovered. She wasn't about to let the case become another unsolved mystery. In a last-ditch effort, Donovan decided to return to the scene of the search, this time with a more focused approach. She enlisted the help of specialized sonar equipment, hoping that a more detailed scan of the nearby waters might reveal something that had been missed before. The creeks, ponds, and lakes around Harper's Ridge had been searched multiple times, but Donovan wasn't willing to take any chances. There was something about the area that still nagged at her. The sonar team worked tirelessly, moving through the murky water, scanning for anything that might point them in the right direction. The hours passed in silence, the only sound the hum of the sonar device. Donovan stood at the edge of the boat, her mind racing through the possibilities. She had a gut feeling that something would break soon, something that would lead her to the truth. And then, just as she was about to call it a day, the sonar picked up something unusual. A dark, unmistakable shape appeared on the screen, just beneath the surface of the water. The team immediately stopped the boat, and Donovan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The team moved quickly to investigate, preparing to dive into the water. The visibility was poor, but the shape on the screen was distinct enough to warrant further investigation. It wasn't long before one of the divers resurfaced, his face grim. He pointed toward the object at the bottom of the lake, and Donovan's stomach twisted in knots. It was a car, a small, older model, clearly submerged for some time. As the diver moved closer, they realized that it was indeed Evelyn's car. There was no mistaking it. The car, now rusted and waterlogged, was wedged between rocks and partially buried in the silt. It had been here all along, hidden beneath the water, waiting to be found. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. This was it, the missing piece of the puzzle. Evelyn's car had been here, hidden in plain sight, all along. And now, finally, they had the evidence they needed to move forward. The car was pulled from the water, and as the investigators combed through it, they found something chilling, a set of fingerprints, faint but unmistakable. These weren't Evelyn's fingerprints. They belonged to someone else. The discovery raised new questions. Who had been in the car with Evelyn? Had she been taken against her will? Had she been in danger the entire time? And if so, who was responsible? Donovan knew that this discovery was just the beginning. The car, once a symbol of Evelyn's last known movements, had now become a key piece of evidence. The road ahead was still unclear, but at least now they were on the right track. The search for Evelyn Harper was far from over, but with this new lead, Donovan felt more certain than ever that the truth was within reach. With Evelyn's car finally found and the evidence pointing to a deeper conspiracy, Detective Claire Donovan's investigation reached a critical juncture. Every lead, every discovery seemed to bring her closer to the truth, but at the same time, the closer she got, the more complicated the case became. As the investigation unfolded, all eyes turned back to Evelyn's husband, Matthew Harper. On the surface, Matthew had seemed like the perfect husband, devoted, calm, and grief-stricken in the wake of his wife's disappearance. However, as Donovan dug deeper into his past and examined his financials, a different picture began to emerge. Matthew had been under significant financial strain, his car dealership struggling to stay afloat, and it was becoming clear that his financial troubles had been worse than he had let on. In the weeks leading up to Evelyn's disappearance, he had taken out a large life insurance policy on her, a policy that would pay out an extra sum if her death was classified as an unexplained disappearance. The timing of this policy was highly suspicious, and Donovan couldn't ignore the possibility that Matthew had something to gain from Evelyn's sudden disappearance. As she began to examine Matthew's behavior more closely, Donovan began to notice more red flags. Despite the gravity of the situation, he remained unnervingly composed. His grief, while believable at first, now seemed calculated, almost as if he were playing a part. He had offered a consistent alibi, claiming he had been at a business dinner the night Evelyn went missing. But when Donovan spoke with Matthew's colleagues, they confirmed his presence. Yet there was something about his retelling of events that didn't quite add up. It was as if he were anticipating every question, rehearsing his answers. Donovan's suspicions were further fueled by Matthew's reluctance to cooperate fully with the investigation. While he had been available for questioning, he had shown little urgency to find his wife. His calm demeanor, coupled with the life insurance policy, suggested that Evelyn's disappearance may not have been the result of some random act of fate. It could have been planned. And Matthew, the man who had been closest to her, might very well have been involved. Donovan also turned her attention to Matthew's relationship with Evelyn. While they had appeared to be the perfect couple, their relationship had been strained for some time. Matthew had been known to be controlling, and there were reports from friends that he had become more possessive in the months leading up to Evelyn's disappearance. It wasn't just the financial pressure or the insurance policy that pointed to a motive. There were deeper psychological factors at play. As Donovan pieced together the evidence, a chilling picture began to form. Matthew's behavior, his alibi, his financial situation, and his increasingly controlling attitude all pointed to a man who may have orchestrated his wife's disappearance for his own gain. The more Donovan learned, the more she realized that the perfect facade that Matthew had built for himself was slowly crumbling. Beneath the surface, there were dangerous secrets. Secrets that Matthew had fought hard to keep hidden. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Matthew Harper had yet to be arrested. Detective Claire Donovan knew that she was getting closer, but the final piece of the puzzle still eluded her. The investigation had led to so many dead ends, and yet, with each discovery, she felt a sense of progress. But the final breakthrough, the moment that would break the case wide open, remained just out of reach. Then one day, a tip came in that changed everything. A hiker, out on a morning walk through the woods near the area where Evelyn's car had been abandoned, stumbled upon something odd. He had been walking along a well-worn path when he noticed an object partially hidden beneath some rocks and dirt. At first, it seemed insignificant, a metal object buried just under the surface. But as he bent down to examine it more closely, he realized it was a locket, tarnished with age but unmistakably familiar. The hiker immediately contacted the authorities, and Donovan was called to the scene. When she arrived and saw the locket for herself, her heart skipped a beat. Inside the locket, there was a photograph of Evelyn, smiling and carefree, as if the weight of the world had not yet pressed down on her. It was an intimate item, a personal connection to the missing woman. The discovery of the locket sent shockwaves through the investigation. It confirmed that Evelyn had been in this area, near the woods, and that she had been close to something, perhaps someone, that had been hidden from the rest of the world. But it also raised new questions. Why had the locket been hidden? Why had it been buried, away from the world's view? Donovan knew that this was more than just a forgotten piece of jewelry. It was a fragment of Evelyn's life, a clue that pointed to something deeper. The locket had been carefully concealed, perhaps by Evelyn herself, perhaps by someone else. It was a sign that Evelyn had been here, in this very spot, possibly in distress, possibly trying to leave behind something she could never forget. The locket sparked new hope in Donovan's heart. This could be the break she had been waiting for. With the locket in hand, she knew that the investigation was about to take a dramatic turn. She felt closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but there was still so much to discover. What had happened to Evelyn? And why had she been forced to leave behind something so personal, so precious? The locket, now in Donovan's possession, was the key to unlocking Evelyn's secrets. As she stood there in the woods holding the small tarnished piece of jewelry, Donovan felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. She knew that the truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. The investigation was no longer just about finding Evelyn. It was about discovering who had truly been behind her disappearance and why they had gone to such lengths to hide the truth. As the investigation continued, Detective Claire Donovan found herself standing on the precipice of discovery. The locket, the fingerprints found in Evelyn's car, the suspicious life insurance policy, and Matthew's increasingly erratic behavior, all of it was beginning to converge. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Donovan could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on her. For weeks, she had been grappling with the unanswered questions surrounding Evelyn's disappearance. But now, with the mounting evidence, everything seemed to be pointing in one direction. Matthew Harper was at the center of it all, but Donovan needed the final confirmation, the moment when everything would come crashing down. That confirmation came in the form of a phone call. Matthew, who had been a seemingly innocent bystander in the investigation, now wanted to speak with Donovan. His voice was calm, eerily so, and his words seemed rehearsed as though he had been preparing for this moment. He asked for a meeting, claiming that he had something important to confess. Donovan agreed to meet him in person, and they arranged to meet in a small park on the outskirts of town. When Donovan arrived, she found Matthew sitting alone on a bench, his face expressionless. He didn't appear to be distraught or anxious, as one might expect from a man whose wife had disappeared. Instead, he seemed detached, almost as if he had already come to terms with what had happened. As they sat across from each other, Matthew finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying sense of finality in his words. "I've been waiting for this moment," he said, looking directly at Donovan. "The truth can't stay buried forever." Matthew confessed to everything. He admitted that he had planned Evelyn's disappearance from the start. The life insurance policy, the withdrawal of money from her account, it had all been part of a carefully orchestrated plan. He had grown tired of their marriage, tired of the financial struggles, and most of all, tired of losing control. When Evelyn began to show signs of wanting to leave him, Matthew had panicked. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not when he stood to gain so much from her death. The confrontation had been violent. In a fit of rage, Matthew had pushed Evelyn during an argument. She had fallen, hitting her head on the edge of a table. In that instant, Evelyn's life had ended. But Matthew wasn't done. He had staged her disappearance, making it look like she had simply vanished into thin air. He had taken her body, disposed of it in the nearby creek, and made sure that every detail of her death would be hidden. Matthew's confession was chilling in its simplicity. There was no remorse, no sense of guilt in his voice. It was as though he had justified his actions in his own mind, rationalizing the murder as a necessary evil. Donovan listened in stunned silence, her mind racing to process the enormity of what Matthew had just revealed. With his confession, the case was finally solved. The truth had been uncovered, but it came at a heavy price. Evelyn's life had been cut short by the very person who had sworn to protect her, and the ripple effects of that loss would be felt throughout the town of Harper's Ridge for years to come. In the days following Matthew Harper's confession, the town of Harper's Ridge was left to grapple with the fallout. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the community. A man who had once been admired for his charm and success was now revealed to be a murderer, and the town struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the cold-blooded killer he had become. For Detective Claire Donovan, the case was both a victory and a tragedy. She had solved the mystery, uncovered the truth, and brought justice to Evelyn, but the cost had been steep. The price of uncovering the truth was the loss of a life that had been taken not by some external force, but by the person who should have cared for it the most. As Donovan sat in her office reviewing the case one last time, she couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered in the air. She had done her job, brought the case to a close, but she couldn't help but wonder if there had been more she could have done for Evelyn. Could she have seen the signs sooner? Could she have stopped Matthew before it was too late? The arrest of Matthew Harper was just the beginning of the town's healing process. It would take time for the community to come to terms with what had happened, to understand how someone they had trusted could have committed such a heinous act. For Evelyn's friends and family, the pain of her loss would never fully heal. Lillian Carter, in particular, was left to grapple with her own feelings of guilt. She had been Evelyn's closest friend, but she had never suspected the danger lurking beneath the surface of her friend's life. Lillian found herself questioning whether she had missed the signs, whether there had been something she could have done to save Evelyn from her fate. As for Matthew, his arrest was a foregone conclusion. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he would stand trial for his wife's murder. But for Donovan, the case had left its mark. She had solved the mystery, but in doing so, she had uncovered the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. The truth, as it so often does, had broken through the surface and exposed the hidden dangers lurking beneath the calm exterior of Harper's Ridge. The town would heal, but the scars would remain. Evelyn's memory would live on, and her story would serve as a reminder of the dangers that can lurk in even the most seemingly perfect of lives. For Detective Donovan, the case was a painful reminder of the complexity of human nature and the lengths people will go to hide their darkest secrets. And though justice had been served, it came at a cost that would never be fully understood. The story of Evelyn Harper's disappearance and Matthew Harper's confession carries a profound lesson about concealment and the dark secrets that can lie hidden in seemingly perfect relationships. The case highlights that beneath the surface of a stable life, there can be dangers that only those involved truly understand. The key lesson here is that dishonesty and manipulation in relationships not only lead to the victim's suffering, but also ensure that the perpetrator ultimately faces the consequences. The story also emphasizes the importance of paying attention to warning signs in personal relationships, as what we see on the outside is not always the full truth. The greatest meaning the story imparts is that no matter how much of the truth is hidden or pushed into the shadows, it will eventually come to light, and the perpetrator cannot escape the repercussions. The cost of deceit and violence is always destruction, not only for the victim, but also for the person who commits the crime. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.